This is exactly part of it. Like, 'cause have you ever worked with anyone who's on the spectrum?
Well, I mean, maybe. It's a spectrum, right? So there's a breadth of spectrum to be on. I mean, it's not like anyone had a second head or anything.
Well, yeah, because people don't look autistic, even if they are. And even if they were, they may not necessarily know, as they can be late diagnosis. And these are generally hard things to talk about, let alone in a professional sense, like in a workplace.
Fortunately, our next speaker is well placed to give us all an insight. She was diagnosed with autism 15 years ago and majored in psychology to learn more about it. Rhiana is a front-end developer with a focus on accessible UX and design. She has a background in educational psychology and made the move to programming 10 years ago after attending a Rails Install Fest.
So she certainly doesn't look autistic, but can she pair?
She says the main consideration with pair programming and autism will be navigating different communication styles. Autistic people tend to be very direct and stay more silent when processing information, rather than those little ums and ahs like a neurotypical person might say whilst thinking. That sounds like pairing with you, Michael.
I'm sure we all have a little bit we're all a little bit on that spectrum. But to tell us more, Rhiana Heppenstall, but you don't look autistic.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I've been very excited to speak at RubyConf. The last few years I've seen so many really good neurodivergency talks on ADHD and dyslexia, and I thought, why not autism? So this is something that I have been learning about and researching for the last 20 years or so, since my youngest sibling was diagnosed with autism. They were 4 and I was 16, and we had no idea what it was. We had no idea what it looked like. Nobody really had any good answers for us, and so this then prompted me then going to university and becoming a lifelong learner in this. So I thought today I will give you all a nice introduction to autism, including how it's diagnosed, what are some of the symptoms, and what are some of the myths and the stereotypes. Oops, my computer doesn't want to stay on. Some of the myths and some of the stereotypes, and we're going to bust some of those myths and stereotypes today. I named this talk because this is exactly what everybody says to me when I tell them they're autistic. When I tell them I'm autistic, not they're autistic. That's what I do. I go up and tell people they're autistic. They go, but you don't look autistic. And that kind of got me thinking. I mean, it's definitely supposed to be a compliment, so that's fine. But it got me thinking, why don't I look autistic? Why doesn't somebody like me, wearing a dress covered in manta rays, with pockets and no tags, why don't I look autistic? So I had a bit of a think about this as my thing stopped working. And I had a bit of a think about this, and I think this quote is a really good one. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It is a spectrum. There are so many different ways that it can present. There are so many different people who have it. There are so many people who have it but don't know they have it. And it can present in so many different ways. There are also all the co-diagnoses that it can come with, like ADHD, Tourette's, OCD as well, and it all makes this wonderful big mix. So I think this is part of it, that we all look completely different, that we have it. But as well as that, in the media, we have a lot of stereotypes about autism, and they tend to go the same kind of way. So this was my first media exposure to autism, Rain Man, which is based off a real person, who is an autistic savant. So autistic savant means that they have one thing that they are very, very, very good at, and everything else not so much. And so then this can then present with them having a lot of, like, repeating a lot of words. This is called echolalia, echolalia, echolalia. And it can have them having a lot of repeated movements, a lot of meltdowns and breakdowns and troubles with emotional regulation. And this is kind of, this was about it at the time. Since then, we have some other stereotypes coming up in the media. This is probably one of the most well-known ones. They don't ever come out and say any of these characters are autistic, but they are presenting the kind of classical autistic stereotypes there. And again, we've got somebody who is very, very good at some things, not so good at other things. Again, it's white men, so this is going to be a theme of autistic stereotypes. And again, somebody who is very, very smart, but struggles with the social and communication. And then when you look back into history, we're now going back and we're going, I wonder if all these historical figures also had autism, like maybe Einstein or Isaac Newton or Mozart or all these other people who, again, are all white men who are very good at particular things. And so this is kind of where these stereotypes can really be harmful, because if you don't fit this exact mold, then you don't really feel like you belong, and that maybe you don't have it, and then it's harder to get diagnosed and it's a lot harder to get treatment. So what does it mean to be actually autistic? So this is one of the myths around autism, is that autistic people kind of maybe lack a bit of creativity or humour. I think we just have a different kind of brand of humour. I think it's very funny. Usually maybe a bit more dry, sort of. I find people with autistic that I meet, really quick-witted. So I think this is a bad myth to have, that we're kind of more technical and less creative. I think autistic people can be, both. Here are some examples of people who are actually autistic. There's a lot of rumours going out there that people like Bill Gates and I think Jerry Seinfeld is claiming to be autistic when he actually is probably not, and he's using it to excuse some questionable behaviour, same as Don Burke. But these people are actually diagnosed with autism. Temple Grandin, who was already covered, is a very well-known autism activist who prefers cows to people, which makes sense. Cows are amazing. I may have grown up on a cow farm. Hannah Gabsey has also written a book on it. Very funny woman. Dan Aykroyd, who created Ghostbusters, also actually autistic. We have Greta Thunberg as well, who's a very big political activist. A lot of things with autism is that we have a very strong sense of values, a very strong sense of fairness, very strong sense of social justice. A lot of people I know with autism are working in getting their further education in environmental sciences, climate change, social justice. So that's a very strong theme. Also, Anthony Hopkins has come out recently as autistic, and Susan Boyle. So lots of different looking people, lots of different backgrounds, lots of different ages. Autism knows no bounds. So if you want to check out a program that has actually autistic people in it, ABC has done some really, really good programming on neurodivergent people. This one in particular, Employable Me, is about autistic people. I think there might also be some people with Tourette's and OCD in there as well, trying to find employment. So this is real-life stories of real-life Australians. They also have Love on the Spectrum, which is autistic people trying to date as well. They've also got a really good series, You Can't Ask That, where they do ask people of lots of different backgrounds and lots of different neurodivergences all the questions, and they give very honest answers. So ABC have done some really good programming in this space. So if you want to see people who are actually autistic, that's a really good way to do it. All right, time to look back at the history of autism. It spans 80 years. Obviously, it goes back further than that, but this is like the last 80 years of history where we've tried to diagnose it, where we've tried to treat people with autism. So we're just going to look at the last 80 years. So it first came about in 1943. And in 1943, it was described as children who had a high intelligence. So this is going back to our stereotypes, but had an emotional disturbance. So they required a lot of really strict routines. They had a lot of meltdowns, and they couldn't quite figure out why. And this is kind of where we start to see the evolution of the autism diagnosis. After that, in 1968, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is used by psychologists and psychiatrists to diagnose every condition under the sun, the second edition of that came out, and they classified it as a form of childhood schizophrenia caused by refrigerator mothers. So this is really horrifying. So they blame mothers if they were too cold towards their children. That's why their children were autistic. This is thankfully no longer thought to be the case. In 1980, they came out with the next version of the DSM, and they took that out, which is really good. And they've put it then under the umbrella of a pervasive developmental disorder, which it is. So what this means is that you're born with it and it's for your whole life. It doesn't come about, it's not caused by these environment conditions, it's not caused by parenting, you're born with it and it's lifelong. So the other ones under this umbrella are things like ADHD, and dyslexia, dyspraxia, all those sorts of ones. In '94, when the fourth version came out, this is where we got Asperger's as introduced into the terminology around autism. We've since gone away from Asperger's because he wasn't a great person, to say the least. But there will be some people who are diagnosed around that time who still identify as having Asperger's or identify as Aspie, and that's okay. Some people also like to be called on the spectrum or autistic or a person with autism, so you kind of take the lead of the person who actually has it as to kind of what they want to be referred to. So this is where we saw the split between kind of the more severe kind of autism and I guess the less severe Asperger's. In 2013, it was then combined again. It's got to keep us on our toes. And it is now just autistic spectrum disorder, and it has 3 levels of severity. So that's what we're going through now. So I'll just go through these levels of autistic spiciness. So at level 1 spicy, this is what they would have diagnosed somebody with Asperger's or high functioning or non-clinical. There's been a lot of terms for it, but that's level 1 spiciness. So that's somebody who can, with support, maintain a job, maintain friendships, maintain relationships, and live a somewhat independent life. Level 2 and 3 levels of spicy autism, that's where they need a lot more support. So this is where the kids might not be able to cope in mainstream school, but they might have to go to a more specialist autistic school. There's a lot around Melbourne, which is really good. And they might need a lot more ongoing care as they get older as well. Oops, wrong way. This takes us to our next myth. Autistic people can't feel empathy. Really don't like this myth. It is out there. This is not part of the diagnostic criteria or anything. Everyone has feelings. Autistic people have feelings. They could definitely feel empathy. It's more of whether or not they can do all the social and communication steps around to demonstrate the empathy that they're feeling. As was said before, with ADHD as well, if somebody says, oh, my grandparent died, I might go, oh, my grandparent died, it was awful, and start talking about my grandparent in order to show empathy, but instead we've got to move away from that sort of thing if you're trying to show a social appropriate sort of empathy and just say, that sucks, because it does suck. And so this is a really bad myth that, yep, autistic people definitely have feelings. Okay. Here are the actual symptoms of autism. It used to be a 50-point checklist. If you got 37 out of 50 on the checklist, you were diagnosed with autism. Yep, it's a lot more nuanced than that. So this is the autistic wheel, which I really, really like. So it shows that for any person with autism, they can have any of these sort of symptoms. And then for any of the symptoms, they can be at any degree of severity. So somebody might have fixation. So this is something that somebody's really passionate about. So it could be trains. For me, it's autism. In case you can't tell, it could be art, it could be makeup, it could be dinosaurs, could be anything. Might also have abnormal or flat speech patterns. If I'm getting a bit tired, you will know because I will go completely monotone. Like it just, if I don't have the energy to keep up all the influxes of my voice. Might also have noise sensitivity. As well as noise sensitivity, it's any of the senses. So you could have light sensitivity. Certain light bulbs are terrible and should not exist. Or you might, a very common one is food sensitivity, so taste sensitivity. And so a lot of people who are autistic have very restrictive diets because of that. As well as this, there might be tics and fidgets. So this is where things like stimming then comes in, because then people stim and they fidget, and this helps calm everything down, so that's quite a good one. Poor eye contact is a very stereotypical one. It comes in degrees. Some people are good at it, some people aren't. It's also something you can coach. I I hear it's not normal to just stare at somebody when they're talking, but we'll see how we go. So if all that is a little bit too much information, the other thing, as was said in the last one, that dogs have ADHD, I am fairly convinced that cats have autism. So this is my cat. Me and her love the same things. We love having a very strict routine where at 10:30 every day she comes and gets me for our morning coffee, where we go sit outside and drink morning coffee. She doesn't drink coffee. We're very happy having the same diet, eating the same foods every day. She hates it when routines are disrupted, so do I. So yeah, really good company. So having a look at the strengths and weaknesses, these were covered a little bit before, so I'm just going in through them from like the autism perspective. So very high attention to detail was already covered, which this is something I've seen as well. With ADHD, it tends to be the other way, so very good seeing the big picture. Autism, very good attention to detail. I think this is a good pair. I think everyone should have this pairing, so then you get to see both, which is really cool. Tend to have very precise communication. So this is where things can break down, because then we have difficulty reading between the lines. If you get a very long email and the point's somewhere in the middle, but they're not quite saying the point, they're kind of going around the point, and it's going to get missed. So this is kind of where some workplace accommodations can be put into place. Very strong sense of loyalty and justice, which, yep, I've covered as well. Also, every autistic person I ever met, I didn't know which column to put this in, but they don't lie. They're very honest, sometimes to a fault. So I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness, but we'll see how we go. Also having a hard time putting themselves into somebody else's shoes. Again, this is where like the perception of the lack of empathy comes in. It's called theory of mind, and autistic people don't tend to have it as well, because it requires a big leap. When somebody tells us what they're experiencing, that's great. I love that. It means I don't have to guess. It means I can accommodate that. It means we can all have a good time. But it's really hard to make that kind of leap. All right, so what causes autism? The short answer is that we're not quite sure. There has been many studies, so many studies, and they're all theories at this point. So one of the more promising ones is genetics, because we see that it is very highly hereditable. Usually, women do get diagnosed later, and usually they get diagnosed at about the same age as the 5 or 10-year-old boy that they have who gets diagnosed, and then they're like, but they're like me. And then they go off and get diagnosed too. I was very lucky to have a younger sibling, so I could get that diagnosed a bit earlier. But yeah, very strong genetic link. A lot of it's to do with brain structures. They've been studying the brain structures of everybody and seeing all the different bits and pieces there. There's possibly differences in mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are what we need to do to watch somebody and learn from watching, and that's something autistic people have trouble with, kind of prefer it to be written down, and doing it ourselves. Learning from watching is very hard. There are some theories that it's to do with in utero conditions and age of the parents. There are some theories to do with food, because autistic people tend to have different gut bacteria to the general population, but then that could be due to the restrictive diet, so we don't really know which one came which, but there is some research being done there. And it is definitely not caused by vaccines. 100% not caused by vaccines. The vaccine debacle came when one person was like, don't use their vaccines, use my vaccines. Their vaccines cause autism, mine don't do that. And he completely falsified that. It was just so he could get his own patent out there. It has been, it's been disproved multiple times. I mean, if anything, it's the opposite. Myth 3, all autistic people are savants or geniuses. So this is one that came out by like these really early depictions, like of Rain Man and such. And this one is a little problematic. For one thing, people who have savantism are usually having a very tough time. They have one thing that they're very good at. If you give For example, I think the one that Rain Man was based off, if you gave him a date in the future, he could tell you what day of the week it was, which is really cool, but not the most practical. So they usually need a lot of support as well. And having the myth that everyone who has autism is also a genius is also not great as well, because if you're not a genius, then you might not feel like you fit in. And if somebody hires you going, oh, you're autistic, that means you're very good at maths, or that means you're very good at this, and you're not very good at those things, then that can also kind of set you up to fail. So when we're looking at the statistics, there is some crossover between autism and savants. It sits around 1 to 10%. Savantism is actually really, really rare. The true savants, as they call them, there is, in a 100-year period, there'll be 100. So it's actually quite a rare one to get like these really, people with these extremely narrow and profound gifts. It's a lot more likely that somebody with autism is going to have intellectual disability. So that's actually quite a common one. Also, as well as obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, 30 to 50%, as it was mentioned earlier, maybe even up to 80%. We're not quite sure. Epilepsy is in there, as well as gastrointestinal symptoms, as well as a lot of anxiety and depression as well. So there's a lot of comorbidities or co-diagnoses that can occur at the same time. And this is part of the reason why we do get a lot of different people showing lots of different bits and pieces, because it's such a wide variety. Myth 4, autism is a boys' disorder. So similar in the way with ADHD, autism really focuses on boys, and a lot more boys are getting diagnosed rather than girls. This is a really big problem in the community. This is a really big problem in research, because excluding girls and women from this kind of research study can lead to treatments that don't work as well for them, and it contributes to the perception that autism doesn't affect women as much as men. And this is also a really dangerous notion, because it just feeds into itself. If you need somebody who matches the criteria to get into your research study, then that research study, and that criteria is biased against boys, and you only get boys in your research studies, and then the research study goes, okay, well, this is how all people with autism are, and this is how we treat it, and then it just keeps folding in on itself, and it's not great. So really hoping that changes in the future. Part of the thing is that there are differences between men and women or boys' autism and girls' autism. I'm going to use quotes because, gender norms are a societal construct that don't really get followed by autistic people. But for the simplicity, men or boys are diagnosed at a higher rate of 4 to 1 to girls. So women tend to get diagnosed later, or they'll get diagnosed incorrectly, or they won't get diagnosed at all. Men tend to have a narrow range of special interests, so maybe 1 to 2, whereas women tend to have a broad one. The stereotype of a little boy with autism is that they're obsessed with trains, only want to talk with trains. Nowadays, it might be a little boy who's obsessed with Minecraft and only wants to talk about Minecraft. Whereas women tend to have more interests. Boys tend to have later speech development, so that's the other kind of key. And all the checks and balances when you have kids is like, where is their speech? How many words are they saying? Girls with autism don't tend to have a speech delay, and if anything, they have average to advanced language skills that are very precise. They also tend to be avid readers. So this was definitely me. Like, part of the reason why I wouldn't have been diagnosed even today with all the things that we know now is because instead of acting out in the classroom, I would just read. That's all I like to do. So I would go into the class, I would do all my work, I would help everyone else with their work, and then that's all I wanted to do after that. A quote by Andy Santiago, if you watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine, is, "The only class I failed was recess." Which is pretty much me. I had no idea what to do with recess. It was unstructured time with my peers. I don't know what to do with that. I like structure and routine. But yeah, and so we're also a lot more likely and a lot more socialised to fit in as well, whereas boys might be like, they'll get there sort of thing. So really important that we understand this, and that, hopefully the research community starts to put in some measures to fix this. All right, so how do we help people? How do we help people with autism? It's at a rate of about 1 in 70, though it is probably more, considering that the women aren't getting diagnosed with it. So it's out there. It's not quite as prevalent as ADHD, but there is a lot out there, and there is a lot of misinformation out there as to what to do. So there are a few treatment options out there. There is no specific medication for autism. There's probably medication for all the co-diagnoses that you'll probably have, but there's no specific medication. There's no growing out of it. It's a pervasive developmental disorder. You were born with it, you will die with it. There's no growing out of it. The differences might become more minute as you get older, because generally what they look at are the social differences between you compared to your peers. And if you have a 5-year-old with the social skills of a 2-year-old, that's very different from a 35-year-old with the social skills of a 32-year-old. So the differences tend to become a bit less pronounced over time. The most important thing, though, and this is what everything's really focusing on, is early detection and early intervention. The earlier you find out that the child has autism, the earlier you do all your testing. Even IQ tests can actually be useful with autism diagnoses, not to get the score, but to see where the peaks and valleys are. Because somebody with autism might have really great verbal, but really great verbal comprehension, but really slow processing times. And this is like what I was saying with pairing, is that sometimes when you're getting in a lot of information and a lot of verbal information from someone, and you're kind of just sitting there waiting for it to process and sink in. So not sure where I was going with that, but But yeah, a lot of therapies, a lot of coaching, and a lot of early intervention, a lot of seeing where your strengths and weaknesses are, a lot of getting help to raise the weaknesses up just gives the best outcomes, which is why it's really important that we start to diagnose people correctly. This is a very important statistic from Australia as of last year. The unemployment rate in Australia for autistic people is 34.1%. This is almost 8 times the rate of people without a disability, and it's over 3 times the rate of people with other disabilities. That sits at around 10%. So this is very high, and this is very scary. It's not that autistic people don't want to work. We do. We want to contribute. We have a lot of passions. We have a lot of skills. We have a lot of things that we're good at. But it is hard to do like interviews and to do like that whole process of getting a job, and then to retain it as well is very challenging. There are some organisations out there which do help this. A lot of them have been established by the government to help people with disabilities in general get jobs. These aren't autistic-specific ones. The NDIS helps with funding, so this helps with funding with schools as well. So if you have a child with autism at a school, they can help get an aide to sit in with your kid in the school, which is really great. Job Access as well has a lot of really good information for employees and employers about how to attract people with disabilities, how to be inclusive, how to retain them. Autism Speaks is mostly lies. We don't really listen to Autism Speaks in the autistic community. The position that they have is that autism is a disease, and that people with autism should be feared, and that they should be treated, and they use very questionable methods in order to try and essentially abuse the autism out of you. So I mostly put it there to flag it with people. If you see any information from that one, don't listen to it. The ones in Australia, though, they tend to be a lot better. Brings us to fifth myth, that autistic people are antisocial. So this one comes up a lot, and it comes up a lot when treating children with autism, like young children. They see the young children playing by themselves, and they go, okay, so autistic people are in, this is what I got told at university, that autistic children are in a bubble, and they just don't want to interact with people. They don't want to interact with people. They don't want to have friends. They're not interested in other kids. It's not stuff they find interesting. They just want to play with their blocks or their trains. And this is a really bad myth, because then instead of supporting the child in order to help them with their social development, in order to help them with their play, in order to help them make connections with other people, we just leave them. And I think that's really, really damaging. So for example, autistic kids might be really good, and autistic adults are really good at parallel play. So parallel play is when you have two kids and they're both playing blocks and they're not interacting at all. And this is great. This is a form of social. This is a form of social that autistic people understand, usually quite happy with. And then as they get older, you're kind of more expected to interact with each other, create a shared space, create a shared set of rules for games. And that's where it gets tricky, and that's where autistic people might need a bit more coaching as it gets more sophisticated. So what does this look like in a workplace? Obviously we're not playing with blocks. We're probably playing with code mostly. And so what does this look like? So basically any inclusive hiring and interview procedure that you've learnt about is good. That's going to help people with autism. So this might be how you word your job ads to make them, to make them more inclusive. This might be, offering breaks or a very structured interview process that they can really follow. That all really helps. Having flexible working conditions really helps. So having the option to work from home is amazing. A lot of people with autism have a lot of sensory overload, too much sensory stimulation, but when you're at home you can control that. You can turn off your lights, you can have your room at the right temperature, you can wear what you want to wear without tags that doesn't drive you up the wall. And you can kind of relax and you can get your job done. So that one's really, really good. I think that's probably the one positive to come out of the pandemic, is that working from home is now very normalised, which is really great. Having a predictable routine and schedule, as well as a predictive list of tasks that you need to do for your job, is very, very good for autism. I think ADHD as well. So knowing exactly what your role is in the company, knowing exactly what your duties are at the company, not having them change suddenly. They can change gradually, but not having them change suddenly, going, oh, okay, now you're responsible for X or Y, that's not okay. So having things being very predictable, having your meetings be very predictable, just having things nice and scheduled. Career mentoring has also been shown to improve outcomes for autistic workers. So this is having a trusted person in the company who's of a higher position in general, really help mentor you through. So if you're having any social difficulties or communication difficulties in your role, that you can go to them, you can talk them through, and you can strategize how best to solve this. My thing's on again, sorry. I didn't know it turns off so much. So having that kind of mentoring is really, really valuable. The next thing, which I've talked about a fair bit, is clear communication. So if you have an autistic employee and they are not doing so good at something, or they've annoyed somebody, or they've said the wrong thing, just letting them know. Most of us will be completely mortified if we've hurt somebody's feelings by accident. I really hate it when that happens, but I really appreciate when people tell me, because then I can learn and then I can do better. A lot of things with autism is that you can learn these social skills, you can learn these social cues. You might learn them in the same way that somebody who's not great at maths learns maths, which is that you need a tutor and you need to do repetition and you need to do drills. But you can learn them, definitely. So that's where mentoring and clear communication can really come in handy. And the last one, this one hasn't been studied, I just put this one in because I like it. Optional social obligations. I really like this one because part of the worry of coming out as autistic or an introvert or whatever is that you're worried that people go, oh, they're autistic, they're an introverted autistic person, they're not going to want to come to drinks, they're not going to want to come to a party, they're not going to want to come to these events. And it's we might. We might need to go to the quiet room sometimes, which RubyConf has, which I'm very appreciative of. But we still like to come. Having social events like this and having social connections and being able to build a community and be part of being part of a community is incredibly important for the well-being of everybody. So having them there, having them optional, not giving them grief if they have to leave after 2 hours because it's too much, that's okay. But the important thing is that always having that door open. Because the issue is that otherwise, what happens is that you get a specific type of burnout that's called autistic burnout. So this is caused when an autistic person is trying to do a job, or they're trying to do a school, or they're trying to do something, and there's no accommodations, there's no support, and then they get burnt out, and then they're unable to go to school or go to work for months, sometimes years, sometimes never. So this is where we really, really need to support our people with autism, and this is where that statistic of autistic people who are unemployed comes in. It comes in because of burnout. The primary cause of burnout that I've seen is masking. So this was touched on earlier, but masking is essentially acting, if that makes sense. So this is something everybody does to some extent. So if you're going in for a job interview, if you're meeting your in-laws for the first time, if you're doing something that's, if you're talking in front of a crowd, you're going to be masking a little bit. You're not going to be acting your normal self. You're going to be trying to put on your best self in order to get through the social interaction before you can go back to normal. The problem is with autism that there isn't really a normal to go back to. Whenever I'm around people, I am masking. It's 100% of the time that I am masking or acting, which is fine in short stints. That's fine. But if you have to do it all day, then it can get very, very tiring. This is why working from home is really good, because the only one that I have to be around is my cat, who's already autistic, so isn't judging me. Well, not for that anyway. So these are some of the side effects of masking. So there are positive side effects to masking. There's a reason why we do this. We do it to fit in. We do it so we can talk to our peers, so we can build those social connections, so we can get jobs, so we can stay in jobs without burning out, so we don't get bullied, so we don't get abused. There are lots of positives to it, which is why we do it. It's very important. The negatives, however, is that it is extremely tiring. It's like being in a job interview all day. It's very, very tiring. It does increase your risk of burnout as well. It increases your risk of imposter syndrome, going, okay, I'm not being my true self in front of anybody, who even am I? And it can also lead to a poor self-image. So in conclusion, when in doubt, ask and accept. I think the most important thing from a workplace standpoint is that you already have all these things in place. Don't wait until you have somebody who comes up and goes, I'm autistic, I need all these things, because they're not going to be able to do that. For one thing, they might not know they have it, they might not be comfortable sharing that information because there is a stigma attached to it. And then they also not only have to come out as autistic, but then they have to think of all the accommodations they need, and then they have to follow through getting the company to put all these accommodations into place. So that's not an ideal situation. That's not going to help anybody. So having them there and then asking everybody, like, what accommodations do you need? These are the ones we offer. Which ones do you want? Is there additional one you might want? And accepting the answer. Accepting that they might not be able to come to every social event. Accepting that they might need to stim at their desk or stim during a meeting. I've always got a cross-stitch that I'm working on during meetings because I have to be doing something with my hands. Other people I know who are neurodivergent will have knitting, they'll have drawing, they'll have those fidget cubes. So just accepting that, they might look a bit different, they might act a bit different, and that's okay, if they're still getting their job done and it's not affecting anybody, it's not hurting anybody, just accepting them for who they are. Because I think that's a real strength in a company, is to have a lot of diversity and a lot of acceptance for who people are. Thank you.